So thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar, The Long Civil Rights Movement, a discussion on resources and ways to approach teaching this topic. So we are going to be recording today's session and posting this on our TPS MTSU page. For a couple things as we get started, one, I want you to remember to keep your mics muted as we go through. It'll just help us to have a cleaner recording for our YouTube page. Also, if you've not already done so, please rename yourself so we see your first and last name. And I think everyone has already done that for us today. And we do want to make today's session interactive. So we will be using the chat box throughout the presentation. So feel free to go ahead and open that. And if you want to introduce yourselves, you can do so. We'll also be using the reaction buttons, the hands clapping and the thumbs up. And then at the end, we're going to do a short Q&A, and you should be able to find the raise hand feature. It's underneath the participant list, and it should be there for you. All right, so as we get started, I wanted to start with this image right here, and I want you guys to pay particular attention to the signs that people are holding. And in the chat box, if you would, kind of tell us what topics you're seeing being discussed here in these signs. So what are some issues that these signs are drawing attention to? And Stacy's going to help me kind of monitor the chat box.
Voting rights, jobs, equal pay.
All right, do you see anything else?
I see, oh yeah, police brutality.
Right. So I like this image right here because I think that, if we see the signs here, if we think about some of the images that we've seen from some of the protests happening around the country over the summer, we see a lot of similarity between the issues being talked about. And of course, this image right here is from the March on Washington in August of 1963. And I think it's important for our students to understand that the events that are happening today, they connect to a longer history in the struggle for civil rights, and helping our students to understand how today's struggle connects to struggles of the past will help them again in understanding just generally what's happening and how this kind of fits into the larger story of our nation's history. When we teach civil rights, oftentimes the things that students will come away from are really, really two people. So they will know about Rosa Parks. They will know that she was a tired seamstress who sat down on a bus one day and refused to give up her seat and was arrested. And they'll know about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who, of course, led marches, made speeches, most famously the I Have a Dream speech. And they might even be able to tell us, that a portion of that speech he talked about his hope that one day his children would be able to grow up and be judged on the content of their character and not on the color of their skin. But too often, the story that some students walk away with is a real simplified version where they think that, one day Parks sat down on a bus and was arrested. Another day, Dr. King had a dream and poof, everything got better. And, that's really, of course, we know not the case. And, that oversimplification of the civil rights movement made me think of this quote that I ran across in an article that I was reading a couple weeks ago. The stories are a wonderful thing and they are dangerous. And I think that too often the way that we have simplified the teachings of the civil rights movement down has made it so that it is dangerous because we've divorced it from all context, and so that too often we don't understand how bigger issues are connected and how movements work. And of course, then that makes it harder for us to understand events that are taking place in the world around us now. And the other thing happens, of course, is that we simplify the people involved in the movements. King is one of those people who has been, grossly oversimplified. And in fact, I, saw this quote here in which he says, the Black Revolution, is that box on my way so I can actually see it. The Black Revolution is much more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It is forcing America to face all its interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. It is exploring evils that are rooted deeply in the whole structure of our society, and suggests that radical reconstruction of society is the real issue to be faced. So if we think about this quote, which was published in an article that was published right after he was assassinated in 1968, this is a statement definitely of King of the later years. This is the King who is connecting the civil rights movement with issues of poverty more broadly, who's tying in the civil rights movement to the anti-war movement, and who is, critiquing capitalism and what's happening. And again, talking about structural systemic issues in our country. This is a different king than the one that we often see, represented in memes on social media. And so I think it's important that we remember when we're teaching these characters or these people that, we're not simplifying them and taking them away from their broader context and how they changed, and evolved throughout their activism. The other thing that we do oftentimes is we take things in isolation. And so we forget that, when we're teaching it, if we have to help students understand that we don't get the years 1954 to 65 and we don't get the modern civil rights movement if we aren't connecting that to events that happened years before. So we have to think about how the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment play into building that foundation for the modern civil rights movement. We don't have a Dr. King if we don't have the creation of historically black colleges and universities. We don't get Dr. King and the others if we don't have a W.E.B. Du Bois and the Niagara movement and a Booker T. Washington. If we don't have Ida B. Wells and the anti-lynching campaign. We also have to think about how other movements factor into this. If we think about the labor movement of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and people like A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and the fact that he's calling for a march on Washington in the mid 1940s, or actually a little bit earlier than that, in the midst of World War II. We have things that are happening in the North. For instance, Marcus Garvey and the Back to Africa movement. And we have an earlier freedom rides that happens in the 1940s as well. And so we have to think about helping our students to understand how we draw these connections to all of these other events and people so that by the time that we get to 54, they understand that, what happens in Montgomery, what happens in Birmingham, what happens in Selma, that all of those things are really happening because of things that happened, decades before that. And so as you're thinking about how to help your students to draw those connections, we wanted to highlight some different resources that we have with our Teaching with Primary Sources MTSU program, because of course we've been doing different workshops in PD on this for a long time. And so I'm going to turn things over to Layla, and she is going to kind of share with you guys some of the different things that we have on our website that are already up and available for you.
All right, hi guys, I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen with you all. Can everybody see that? Just give me a thumbs up if you can. Awesome. I like the small group. We're not even using the reactions today. Cool. So thank you, Kira. My name is Layla Smallwood, and I'm a graduate research assistant with the Teaching with Primary Sources team. And today I'm gonna be sharing with you some of our Teaching with Primary Sources MTSU resources with you all. So I wanted to get started by asking a question from you all. So in the chat box, could you just type for me, what do you think are the pivotal movements or moments for civil rights? So big moments that can't be left out.
The 13th Amendment.
Okay, good.
Yeah, ending slavery. Truman's desegregation of the military in World War II, the March on Washington, and the return of the Black servicemen from World War II. And of course, everything that was on Kira's slide earlier.
Right, just take a screenshot of that.
The abolitionist movement, self-protection groups, Reconstruction, Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois' talented 10th, the formation of the NAACP, Brown versus Board of Education, and Black Lives Matter.
Awesome. Good. So I'm glad that even though we have a small group, everybody's still interacting and participating. So now I just want you to look at this timeline I put together. Hopefully some of those pieces that you mentioned will be on here. Just this timeline, a few pivotal moments for Black equality in the civil rights movement, the long civil rights movement. So in the chat box, after you look at this for a second, what's missing? Do you see anything here that should, that's not listed, anything that should be added? in the chat box, just type that in for me.
Abolition is not listed. The church bombings, the anti-lynching campaigns. And let's see. Women getting the right to vote, and so, you know, women's suffrage, participation of African American women in that movement. I don't see the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, Malcolm X, and the Black Power movement and the activities in the North.
Good. Yeah, so a lot of stuff missing here. This timeline is actually, I took some of these pieces from the Michigan State University library, their Milestones in Black History article. So I've linked that in this PowerPoint for you later to go back and review. But I just wanted to start off with an activity like this because there are so many moments in civil rights history, especially the long civil rights history. And oftentimes it's really easy as teachers to accidentally miss something really pivotal, something really important when we're teaching our students. So I wanted to get us all in the right mindset. And thank you, Kira, for that presentation earlier. That really helped to kind of help us connect these events, the long civil rights movement, not just events happening separate from one another. They're all connected. So all of these events that we've discussed and that we will be discussing today are intertwined with one another. And I think that's really important as educators that we emphasize that with our students. So I'm going to ask you guys to talk with me one more time. So when thinking about a timeline of eras within the civil rights movement, in the chat box, when in history would you place Reconstruction? So go ahead and answer that for me. What time period would you say Reconstruction is? And then what time period would you place the New South movement or the New South time period? Where would you place that?
Reconstructions would vary from state to state, but approximately from the end of the Civil War till 1877.
Cool.
So I'm thinking New South is right after that.
Okay. So like post, like late 1870s to 1880s, starting in that time period. Okay, and then Jim Crow, the Jim Crow era, where would you place that?
About, here's the long Jim Crow movement, 1870s to 1950s, or
Okay.
1896, starting with Plessy versus Ferguson to the 1950s.
Okay. And then what about the modern civil rights movement? Our last little question here, modern civil rights movement, where would you place that on a timeline?
I would say that's with the return of the African-American servicemen from World War II, or beginning later than that with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So until 1965, with
Okay.
the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act.
Good. All right, guys, so I just wanted to have that kind of discussion because this kind of varies depending on what you're teaching, what standard you're looking at teaching and where you're coming from. So all of these areas kind of seem to overlap in one way or another. When I'm using the term Reconstruction, I'm talking about specifically on TPS, we've kind of outlined these in our newsletters. Reconstruction is going to be 1865 to the 1890s. New South is going to be 1870s to the 1890s. Jim Crow is going to be that long movement, 1877 to 1964. And then our modern civil rights movement is going to be about 1955 with the murder of Emmett Till to 1965. So just wanted to have everybody, like I said, in the right mindset. So when I'm discussing these terms with you and our resources, you know what I'm talking about, but they all seem to overlap. So pretty interesting. I didn't realize that when I first started putting this presentation together. All right, guys, so I'm going to be showing you resources today, and the website where all of these resources are housed is going to be library.mtsu.edu/TPS. So that's our home webpage. Do we have any questions or comments before I go on? No? All right, guys, so I wanted to first show you all of our lesson plans that are related to Black equality and the long civil rights movement. If you go to the Teaching with Primary Sources homepage, remember that's library.mtsu.edu/TPS, you will see that we have all of our lesson plans listed. So if you're on our homepage, you'll see this menu over here on the left, and then you'll click on lesson plans and activities. And they're all going to be listed in chronological order to make it easier on you. The lesson plans I pulled from MTSU's resources highlight events starting with around the time of Reconstruction, so that 1865 period, and traces the struggles for equality leading up to the modern civil rights period, so about 1965, and the legacies after. So the themes we see in all of these lesson plans are struggle, perseverance, and the continual resistance against systemic racism among Black Americans. So that's a theme we see, or themes we see continuously throughout these lesson plans. Each lesson plan has a brief little snapshot of the possible grade ranges, the content area that maybe these lesson plans would work for that you could tweak to make it work. And also to make it a little bit easier on you. I know you're teachers, you have a lot of stuff on your plate, so as little work as possible for you guys prepping this stuff. So I've included lesson plans, screenshots of the little kind of snapshots of the lesson plans we have on our website for you all to see today. I'm going to go through and show you this. So these are just some lesson plans that we have linked here. You see they're starting in 1865 and looking at American citizenship and going all the way through the long civil rights movement. So these are just some examples of lesson plans that we have available. And here is an example of a lesson plan that was created in the summer of 2019 during our Summer Teacher Institute. It requires students to dig into sources from nonviolent movements during the modern civil rights movement. And this lesson plan title is Civil Rights Movement Strategies, Nonviolent Direct Action. So I didn't include the procedure here because that depends on what you're teaching and who you're teaching grade level wise, how you make it work. But I did include our overview. All of our lesson plans include historical background or overviews on the first page. You'll see that, you'll see that on the far left-hand side of the screen. And they also have curriculum standards. All of our lesson plans are going to be standards aligned. So you see this middle page here, I have the understanding goals and objectives. The standards are listed on the far left page. And then we have all of the materials and resources listed as well. So it's super easy for you. Everything's hyperlinked either in the document or to the web page that we got it from. So this lesson plan includes 4 sets of sources for 4 groups, a handout for keywords, and a definition guide for students to refer back to while evaluating the sources. So these 2 sources on the right-hand side of your screen are just one set of group resources. And then I've just hyperlinked, so when you get the folder for all of these resources we're sharing today, I've just hyperlinked these lesson plans. That way you can go in and click on whatever you need if you don't want to go search for them on the website. Do we have any comments or questions? Okay, cool. So we also offer newsletters on civil rights at least once a year, whether it's the modern civil rights movement or the long movement. Our Summer Teacher Institute has offered sessions that trace civil rights from Reconstruction to the modern civil rights movement. For each institute, we do a newsletter on that theme. Our newsletters date back to 2009, and they're all archived on our website. So super easy to find. Just go to that homepage. You'll see the blue drop-down menu on the left-hand side on the homepage and go to newsletters, and they're all spaced out by the year. The newsletters often include brief overviews of the topic, 3 to 4 lesson ideas on the topic, and then 4 sources from the Library of Congress, sometimes documents, images, or other resources to use when creating lessons. So I just have 2 newsletters I want to share with you guys really quickly. So these are just some of our newsletters. They're hyperlinked if you want them later on. And here are some examples of our newsletters. This newsletter is the Reconstruction newsletter from June 2015. It highlights the Reconstruction era, like we talked about 1865 to 1890. The Civil War brought 4 years of destruction. We all know this, an intense conflict to Tennessee and other states in the region, or other states in the South. The Reconstruction period undertook the long and painful task of rebuilding society and the landscape that was damaged and devastated by war. So this newsletter, excuse me, not website, gives you 4 different lesson ideas. We have one on the Memphis race riots, one on Johnson's impeachment, one on the early KKK, and a featured feature, which is a little bit more in depth of a lesson plan, the Hayes-Tilden election, to really get into that Reconstruction, those Reconstruction politics in 1876-77. And then I have examples of our page 4 at the end as well. You see we have little prompts for the question, or prompts for the images on page 4. These are our last 2 documents. Whoops. On the bottom. So little questions and information, and everything's hyperlinked in the newsletter, so it's easy for you to find and easy for you to use in your lesson plans. And this is just another example of a more modern, or not more modern, more recent newsletter. This is the Modern Civil Rights Movement newsletter. You see we have an idea for the Montgomery bus boycott featuring Rosa Parks, Tennessee in the movement, which is really going to be important for our 5th grade teachers and our high school Tennessee history teachers. An idea on the freedom rides and the routes taken by the freedom riders, and then strategies in the movement, which kind of go along with that lesson plan I showed you, those nonviolent strategies. And then again, our page 4s at the bottom. These page 4s kind of show the long movement as well, because 100 years before the Montgomery bus boycott, we get into a woman not wanting to give up her seat on the bus, or not on the bus, on a trolley car, excuse me. So interesting to show your students that and then discuss Rosa Parks to really bring in that long civil rights movement. All right. The last thing I'm going to briefly show you all are the primary source sets that we've created to go with certain lesson plans and newsletters and other content that we're doing, workshop content specifically. Our primary source sets are a lot like our newsletters, and they're listed in chronological order. Just like you go to the homepage for the other stuff, you'll be on the homepage, TPS homepage, and you'll see the little blue drop-down menu, and you'll go to primary source sets right there. So primary source sets are listed in chronological order, and they include documents, images, maps, and other resources to teach specific topics in history. I've listed on this PowerPoint some of the primary sources that we have available to use when teaching the long civil rights movement. Again, all of this information is hyperlinked, just like our lesson plans, just like our newsletters, and it all prints out in PDF format to make your life a little bit easier. So just some examples of our primary source sets. Like our lesson plans, they have a little snapshot overview for you to look at. And the 2 primary source sets I just wanted to share with you all are hyperlinked in this PowerPoint as well. The first one is titled New South, and it includes a section for historical background, like our lesson plans, and suggestions for teachers when using the primary source documents and the primary source sets. So there are also about 8 pages of images, documents, maps, and other primary source, other helpful primary sources you can use in your class. I couldn't fit them all on this page. PowerPoint would not let me fit all the stuff from this primary source set on the page, but there are about 4 or 5 more pages. We also include citations of our primary source sets in case something gets moved around. It helps us find it later on. And it also can help you if you're stuck in trying to get something very quickly. It makes finding resources a little bit easier to have those citations listed at the end. The other primary source that I have featured is a newer one. It's from the summer of 2019, and it was for our Summer Teacher Institute on the dawn of the modern civil rights movement. This primary source set really connects to the other primary source sets I have listed here. You can see how these events are building off of one another. If you look at the primary source sets that I've listed, you can see how they're all connected and intertwined. This primary source set, like I said, really brings everything together. It makes it easier to see the long civil rights movement theme throughout American history. So all of these resources are available at our website. That's just library.mtsu.edu/TPS. And this PowerPoint will also be made available to you through the Google Drive or the Google folder. You'll have access to that. Does anybody have questions on these specific resources? It was a crash course, or where to find them.
Hey, Layla, if you would, will you go back to your slide that had the eras broken down? Because Shay had a question about why those eras are dated when they are. And I will take just a moment to kind of talk about that. So one reason that we have done ours the way we have over the years is trying to think about this long civil rights movement and pull together pieces, like, again, figure out the building blocks to it, right? So, you know, we did Civil War for a long time. And so we, of course, as we were doing that, we did emancipation. That's kind of the first step. And then Reconstruction, of course, starts with the end of the war. So 1865, we typically end Reconstruction as an official date, 1877. And that corresponds with the compromise, with the election of 1876 and the compromise that was come up with in order to resolve that disputed election, in which Rutherford B. Hayes basically makes a deal that withdraws all of the federal troops from the South, kind of officially ending Reconstruction. And so that's typically where you will see that date as far as the end of Reconstruction. So New South then kind of picks up there. So once Reconstruction has ended, but of course Reconstruction really varies by location. So like Tennessee Reconstruction, official Reconstruction is much shorter, but just kind of a broad generally, we'll say 1877. So New South is going to pick up. And so basically how different areas were trying to rebuild after the war and after Reconstruction. So you see a lot of like the beginnings of industrialization in the South. You see how different Reconstruction policies have played out and how African-American community has been built during that time period. And so that is also the period that typically have Black codes. And so you don't have formalized segregation yet. You don't really get that until you get into the 1890s up to 1896. And it's also during that New South period that you have some pushback as far as areas trying to begin to figure out ways to restrict voting by African-American men. We date Jim Crow period typically beginning in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson, but of course you did have some localized laws that were starting a little bit before that, but you don't have it officially as a approved by the Supreme Court until 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson. And then that you can really, I mean, depending on how you want it, you can go up to 1964 because it's then that the Civil Rights Act officially overturns segregation and public accommodations. And so that is how we have kind of come up with that. And of course, the modern civil rights movement, you have lots of people who date it with different things. You can use either the lynching of Emmett Till as a start date. You can use the return of African-American servicemen in World War II and use that as a start date, or the Brown versus Board of Education. And so historians have been arguing over the official start date for a long time. And so you can make the case for really any of those events. So hopefully that kind of helps to explain some of those dates a little bit.
And on our newsletters, we actually have, like in the overview for the newsletters, we have these timelines listed. So we say we're like saying Reconstruction's 1865 to the 1890s, and it explains a little bit more also like why we've chosen those time periods. So if you're looking for a little bit of like a written justification, that's also on all of these newsletters I have listed, the time period that we're focusing on. So that's why I have these dates here. It's what corresponds to our newsletters. All right, guys. So if you don't have any questions, just give me a thumbs up reaction or give me a thumbs up. I can see you either way. We don't have too big of a group today. Great. All right, guys. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Kira. Thanks.
All right, so kind of picking up with that theme that we were talking about earlier about kind of the long civil rights movement, I want to take a few minutes and talk about one particular lesson plan that we have. It's the Road to Brown versus Board of Education. And I like this one a lot because it does a couple of different things. One is it digs into the legal side of the civil rights movement, which is oftentimes neglected because, you know, reading legal court documents isn't quite as flashy as, you know, seeing video of people marching and singing. And the other thing is that this lesson plan really connects activities that were happening in the 30s, 40s, and early 50s and show us how those things are building us towards 1954 and the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And so this lesson plan is a 2-day lesson plan. It's written for high school, but you could, of course, adapt it to younger grade levels if you wanted to pick out bits and pieces of it. The investigative question for this one is, how did the legal victories leading up to Brown versus Board of Education lay a foundation to attack segregation in public education more broadly? And then what's the overall significance of Brown? You'll see it referenced in a lot of stuff when you get into like teaching about the movement. And so why is Brown so important? So to start with, in the chat box, if you guys would, I want you to think about what you know about the 14th Amendment, Plessy versus Ferguson, segregation, and the NAACP. So just real quick, if you want to put in the chat box some core things that you know about one of those 4 things. I like to start with a fact storming with students because oftentimes this will help them to connect prior knowledge. And it'll also help you to figure out too if there are gaps in that prior knowledge that you might need to take a moment to kind of fill in as you're getting into the lesson.
Well, to start, Kira, the 14th Amendment is where we get the whole due process, and that's a very important clause.
Right, so we have equal protection and due process.
Right, equal protection. And that's one of the Reconstruction ones. So, and then of course, separate but equal is with the Supreme Court case, Plessy. And segregation was both de facto and de jure.
Right.
Which we would have to explain those to students because, you know, at first they'll be like that, but it's so important in how it's legally and socially interpreted. So that's a really good point.
Right, and then of course the other thing, you know, the NAACP, the fact that it's the oldest of the civil rights organizations and the one really that had been working, you know, to try to address racial injustice in the country since the early 1900s. So again, if you have students in kind of a basic understanding of those 4 principles as you kind of launch into this lesson plan. All right, thank you guys. So the first person we want to introduce them to is Charles Hamilton Houston. He is a World War I veteran. He had been born in Washington, D.C. He was a Harvard-educated attorney who'd actually studied under Felix Frankfurter, who is later a Supreme Court justice. He's also the vice dean for Howard Law School. And that's really why he's so important in this part of the story, because while he's working at Howard, he's training an entire generation of attorneys that are going to have a profound impact on the civil rights movement. Howard really becomes the civil rights, you know, legal training school. And so it's really important that students have a basic understanding of who he is, and again, the work that he's doing in the 30s and 40s, and how that's really going to set the stage for stuff that we're going to see in the 50s and 60s. So part of what he is doing is he's brought on by the NAACP and the American Fund for Public Service, and they're trying to figure out a way, you know, kind of what their legal strategy is going to be. And so I'm going to read us an excerpt from this document here. And as I'm reading it, I want to read this in case you guys can't see it good on the screen. I want you to think about this question. Why does Houston want to concentrate their legal efforts on fighting segregation in public education? All right, so let me see if I can move. Well, hold on. All right. So on a budget of $10,000, it is exceedingly difficult to execute an effective program on a national scale on 2 issues as large as discrimination in education and discrimination in transportation. Isolated suits mean little unless the communities and persons affected believe there is an unexpended reserve available to sustain a persistent struggle. This calls for concentration of effort. At the present time, the issue of discrimination in education is far more acute than that of transportation. All education, white and Negro, is feeling the pinch of the Depression. But in the South, common rumor is that Negro education is being sacrificed so as to save white education from being curtailed. This is distressingly true in the allocation of PWA and other public funds for the purposes of building and repairing school buildings, payment of teacher salaries, etc. The state universities are kept open for whites, while Negro taxpayers are compelled to send their children out of the state at their own expense for higher education. The ideals and efficiencies of an entire generation are at stake. So again, in the chat box, if you would, what are some things that kind of stand out to you guys in that excerpt?
Well, for starters, the Depression, it's like you're talking about being disconnected from, you know, larger context, knowing that how hard it is to fund public education in a Depression period. I mean, that's important to note. And then the Negro taxpayers are supporting the white education at the expense of their own kids during a time of financial pressure for everybody. Discrimination, prioritization, also the word acute to really drive home why education over transportation.
Right. I mean, yes, all those things. And the other thing I think at the beginning of this is thinking about, as they were, there's so many issues that they could have been focusing their legal efforts on, right? And so thinking about, what do we need to do in order to have a successful effort? And so we have these two big areas, education and transportation, and we can't do both and do them both well. So that phrase here, this calls for concentration of effort. And so again, then going on into all the things we talked about why education was particularly important. And so I think this is a great text to use to kind of get at that early piece. And again, the fact that there was strategy and thought behind how they were moving forward at this point in time. So in thinking about how they were then going to attack, segregation in education, we have a short clip from Robert Carter, who is one of those people who went to Howard Law School and was trained under Houston, and then goes on to work with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He's actually on the team that litigates the Brown case. So we are going to take just a moment and let me pull this up, and we will listen to just 2 minutes of his oral history here.
What was it like to be a law student at Howard University? You enrolled in 1937 in the fall.
Well, it was at the time Howard was on a special mission. The Charles Houston had a program that we were going to fight segregation, the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson. And we were going to fight it by making all the institutions, state institutions, that offered courses for whites and not for blacks, to offer duplicate courses for blacks, or establish separate schools for blacks. And we knew that they couldn't do that. And finally what happened was that as we fought to make them offer these separate courses, we realized that they could now pay for it. And so they began to, in the graduate school, they began to accept blacks without segregation. Or they would do as they did in my first.
Okay, we'll stop there. So what are some things that we can take away from that piece of his oral history? What was Houston's plan?
Well, he's forcing them to uphold the 1896 law of separate but equal, and showing them, exposing that they can't even do that. So using their own policies against them.
Right. He's saying, again, if we're going to have separate but equal, we're going to at least make you live up to that. And again, keep in mind, this is happening right on the heels of the Depression, when, there's not a lot of funding for building new schools. And so, they're going to see, they knew that they couldn't afford that. So again, let's put pressure on them. Let's make them, if they either build us new schools, which again, we know we can't afford to, or this will force them to actually begin to desegregate. And he mentions, of course, the professional schools. We're starting with graduate education at the top and then kind of working their way down. Again, picking the low-hanging fruit as far as how they were going to attack in the court system. So in the lesson plan, what we have students do is divide up into 4 groups, and they look at 4 specific cases. They look at Murray versus Maryland, Gaines versus Canada, McLaurin versus Oklahoma, and Sweat versus Painter. And each of these deal with cases where, again, it's graduate education, so law schools or graduate education program. In which case, each of these are people who were highly qualified, but were being denied admittance based on their race. And in each of these cases, what happens is that the court finds that essentially because they're being denied based on their race, that it's in violation of their 14th Amendment. And we also see within these how the states are, still trying to thwart trying to desegregate their program. So, in the Gaines versus Canada case, we have the state come in and, the state of Missouri says, oh, we'll eventually create a law school for African Americans. But the court says just a promise, an eventual one is not enough. You have to actually admit him into the University of Maryland Law or Missouri Law School. With McLaurin versus Oklahoma, we have a case where McLaurin is admitted into Oklahoma, but then the school tries to basically segregate him on campus so that he's, told he has to sit in a specific place in the classrooms. He has a separate place he can sit in the library, a separate place that he can sit in the cafeteria, and the court comes back and says you can't do that to him on campus because, again, you're still violating his 14th Amendment rights. And then with the Sweat versus Painter case, what we have here is the University of Texas Law School basically says, again, in order to prevent admitting Herman Sweat, what we'll do is, again, we're going to create you your own special, your own law school. But the court comes back and says you can't, because if you, even by creating this new law school just for him, a law school for one, it is not going to have the same equal education as a pre-existing established law school. You're not going to have the same access to the same quality of faculty, the library, legal writing services, just the overall prestige of the school. Like, you have to, again, in order to protect his 14th Amendment rights, you have to admit him into that law school. So with each one of these cases, what happens is that the NAACP is able to chip away at segregation within higher education. And then what we see happen with this, and with this, Thurgood Marshall had actually been working with Houston on all of these cases. So that by the early 1950s, Marshall begins making the argument that they actually need to expand and change their approach a bit, that they have basically picked all the low-hanging fruit. And so now it was time to take a more kind of full frontal approach on segregation in education. And so we would have students look at this document right here with the question thinking about, what argument is Marshall laying out and how is his approach different from Houston's? Now, this one is a little bit difficult to read when you print it out, but I want to read one small quote from this one. So this is under section A. So the first point there, he says, the mere unjustified fact of segregation education is unconstitutional. So just write out, segregation education is unconstitutional. That is his borderline statement, right? And his second point under that, Plessy versus Ferguson is inapplicable in this case. And in this one, they're talking specifically about building towards the Brown case. And even under separate but equal interpretations, the Constitution is being violated because the uncontradicted evidence shows that segregation per se constitutes an inequality. So again, Marshall is making the point, you cannot segregate people and possibly say that it's equal. So again, that is the approach going forward, like that we are, instead of, again, just saying you can do separate and we'll, supposedly have it be equal. Now he's saying that, segregation, especially within education here, is never going to be equal. And that really kind of changes the dynamic in how they begin to approach these cases. The other really interesting thing that factors in here is the work of a social psychologist, Dr. Kenneth Clark, and his wife. The two of them are conducting what are called doll tests, and they were doing this, I believe they were in New York. So they were having interviews with young children, often young African-American children, and basically putting before them two different dolls, a white doll and a black doll, and they would ask them a series of questions. And what they were hoping to discover in asking the questions and having the kids pick which doll they associated with each question was trying to understand the impact of racial identity and segregation and racism on the psyches of these young kids. So what becomes very clear in their evidence is that even at a very young age, racism and segregation were impacting how these students felt about themselves. So they would ask them, for example, a question, which doll is the good doll? And oftentimes the children would pick the white doll. And again, this was just showing them, again, just how horrendous the impact of racial segregation and racism was on these young kids. What's really fascinating about how this connects with the Brown case, as they're arguing the Brown case before the Supreme Court, Marshall and his team bring in Dr. Clark and his wife and have them share their results. They actually testify as expert witnesses in that case. And when the decision is handed down, their findings are actually included in the final brief for the Brown versus Board of Education case, which was the first time that any social psychology experiment like this was actually cited in a Supreme Court case in the country. So that's just a really kind of interesting aside and kind of how they were able to show the impact of segregation on kids. So in May of 1954, the Brown decision is handed down, and it's a unanimous decision. And you'll see here, this is actually Chief Justice Earl Warren's reading copy for that. You'll see out on the side of it, he actually makes a note about it being a unanimous decision. Warren knew this was going to be a big deal. And so they were very deliberate in how they wrote the decision in order to make sure that it would be a unanimous decision from the court. And so he says here in the brief, so separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And it goes on to say that they're deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. So again, looking at this and kind of again how this finally plays out, we see that long connection between what Houston was doing and how each of those cases, citing the 14th Amendment, laid the groundwork to get to 1954 into this decision. Now, what we also know is that in order for this to be a unanimous decision, they really couldn't lay out specifics about how it would be implemented. And in fact, kind of kicked the can down the road, with this first one in order to make it unanimous. So it's a year later in 1955 that we get the Brown 2 decision, in which case, local school districts were basically invited to come in and give their thoughts on how they might begin to desegregate. And what the court eventually does here is say that the decision should be implemented with all deliberate speed. Now, what we know about how that all deliberate speed played out is that in most locations, it's really the late 1960s into the 1970s before a lot of places begin to see, real movement towards desegregating education. So this is still a long, drawn-out fight, but this decision does lay the groundwork for so much of what we see happening in the modern civil rights movement. So what we would want students to kind of reflect on at the end of this is thinking about, what is the significance, of those preceding cases, and thinking about how all of this kind of plays together and how this laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement. I mean, this is a subject I've always been really interested in, but I think it's fascinating to look at how they built the legal cases for this and how it was so very strategic. And again, then how this factors into other things that happened in the movement. So you guys can find the lesson plan on our website. I think that's one of the things that you should have seen, I think within Layla's presentation, it popped up there. And if you have questions about it, I invite you guys to contact us and let us know. And we will have some time at the very end here in a moment after Stacy's shares with us a few things for some questions. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Stacy to share with us some other really cool resources.
Thanks, Kira. And I'm really just going to take just a few minutes for a few additional sources. And I'm going to start off by, okay, so this is the TPS MTSU homepage. Can you see that all right? Okay, so I actually want to show you a couple of things that you can find from the MTSU Walker Library homepage. And you do not have to be an MTSU employee or student to access these things. So these are totally free for you guys to use. And if you look where it says find resources here along the top banner and you click on it, just go to the second choice, which is digital collections. And these are all things that have been digitized and made available. And primary sources along with context to go with them. And there are two websites here that I want to point out. The first is this Trials, Triumphs, and Transformations. And then the second is Southern Places. So I'm going to just take a second for each of these to show you kind of what's in them. So under Trials, Triumphs, and Transformations, basically this is taking Tennesseans' search for citizenship, community, and opportunity, focusing largely on the African American experience in that long civil rights period that we're just talking about this whole hour. And it's divided up into themes though. It's not chronological, it's thematic. So if you just click on themes, you can see that we have embracing citizenship, transforming the economy, finding community, claiming space, achieving recognition, and performing identity. And each of these different themes has a set of primary source images to go with them, context in the form of blurbs or even scholarly written essays, and even lesson plans that were created by our team at TPS to go with these. And so it's just like, for instance, a really great way to and this is also something that you can have students look at if they have access to computers, which I guess everybody is doing now. So that's kind of what that looks like. This is something that was created in partnership between the Center for Historic Preservation and Walker Library. Our colleague Susan Knowles was very instrumental in that. So, oops, lost my page. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you real quick was Southern Places. And so where we work, the Center for Historic Preservation has been doing field work for 35 years or so now. And a lot of our photographs and field notes and National Register nominations have been digitized and made available to the public through this project. And so, and of course, we've been working on sites that have to do with the civil rights movement in Tennessee for over 30 years. And so you can find a lot of great stuff here too. And it's a good way to bring in local history. So I'm just going to click on the very first topic, African American churches, to show you an example of what you could find. This also goes beyond Tennessee because Dr. West actually wrote the National Register nomination for all the Civil War sites in Birmingham, Civil rights sites in Birmingham, Alabama. So for instance, you see this 22nd Avenue Baptist Church. That was one of the churches where they had a lot of meetings for the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the early 60s there. And it's a good example of a site associated with civil rights movement in an urban context. There are also tons of places from a rural context too. Just looking at this screen here, you can see within the Alexandria, that's over in DeKalb County, really tiny, beautiful place. There's a cemeteries historic district. You have a white cemetery, a black cemetery, and a little church that was used by African Americans since right after the Civil War. And then the building there dates from the 1930s. And so, and this, of course, Alexandria, that's where W.B. Du Bois was a public school teacher for a very short while, and talks about that in our Crossing the Veil lesson plan that Layla showed to you too. So you just get a whole variety of different kinds of sites. And these are all available through the Content DM platform. And so public domain, please feel free to use them. And the last thing I want to show you is one of our new web pages within our website where we have gathered all the close reading exercises that we started creating at the beginning of quarantine and making available. Now, a lot of them are part of the topic of this long civil rights movement. So, you know, a poem by Phyllis Wheatley. She was a 20-year-old African-American enslaved woman who actually had a book of poetry published in the 18th century in the United States. Pretty amazing. Benjamin Banneker, He was an African-American scholar who actually wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson calling him out on the discrepancy between his all men are created equal and his white supremacist kind of notions that he espoused in Notes on the State of Virginia. Also, Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau is important because it actually has a lot of influence on later thinkers in the nonviolent protest movement, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Frederick Douglass, the Ida B. Wells anti-lynching campaign, Lift Every Voice and Sing, the African-American national anthem, so to speak, by James Weldon Johnson, who was a figure in the Harlem Renaissance. Ballad of Booker T by Langston Hughes, a later and also very important figure in the Harlem Renaissance. And Brown versus Board of Education, I'm gonna show that one real fast. Since this is what Kira just was talking about, we created a little exercise to go along with that for 5th grade and high school. And then the last one I wanted to show you, letter from Birmingham jail. This is one that was created, we posted this on Facebook just a week after the George Floyd shooting in response to all the Black Lives Matter protest movement across the country. And so I thought it was very timely and a way for you to connect what your students are seeing in the news versus, you know, what has happened in the past to, again, reinforce in their minds that all these things are connected. Every generation is kind of fighting the same battles, but a little different every time. So those are just 3 things I wanted to show you. And I'm going to throw it back to Kira. Stop share.
All right, so at this point, if you guys have any questions, if you want to use the raise hand feature, we'd be happy to take questions. If you've not had a chance to check out those close reading exercises, they are really cool. Highly recommend them. Questions? All right, so Shay, did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to say thank you. I really enjoyed today's webinar.
Well, thank you. So as we get ready to wrap up, we are doing a series of webinars throughout the fall semester. And so I wanted to just kind of bring your attention to those. Our next one up, we're doing a series with Discover Tennessee History. That's an initiative with several other organizations that are going to be participating in that. So you guys find more information on our website for that series that we're running through March. We'll be doing one a month. Our newsletter theme that just, newsletter for this month that just went out today was on fads in history. And kind of connected to today's topic, we're actually going to be spending some time in that when talking about our lesson idea on minstrel shows and the use of blackface. And so that'll be part of that webinar, and that's going to be on September the 10th. And then we're going to be doing these new peer-to-peer discussion groups. And so we're going to be doing 2 of these in the fall and then 2 in the spring. In the fall, we're going to be talking about strategies for engaging students in virtual classrooms. And again, this is going to be a good opportunity just to kind of talk with your colleagues and kind of get some ideas and kind of share in a small group kind of discussion environment. And then October the 8th, we'll be doing another session on modern America. We have several others coming up. You can find the full list on our website. So I would recommend taking a look at that if you don't have a chance. And of course, we will be posting many of these on our website. We will not be posting the online discussion sessions. Those will not be posted for viewing later on. That's going to be kind of either you can join us or you can't. And finally, we want you guys, if you would, to give us some feedback. Again, we are still kind of playing with some different formats and some ideas for how to offer PD right now, given how different the school year is. So if you would take a moment to complete the survey, and Stacy, if you could drop that into the chat box, that'd be great.
Yes, I just did. That's in the chat box for those of you who are with us.
Yeah, if you would, that would be great. Just take a moment to fill that out. And again, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to join us today. I know it's difficult to carve out some extra time at the end of an already busy school day, but we really do appreciate your time. So thank you, and I will stop our recording.